Welcome back, everyone. So for the second part of the presentation, we'll be looking at the specific ships, including Belgian fighter Examelia, Firethorn, Aldington Court, and City of Johannesburg, all sunk by the U-boats mentioned in the first presentation, as well as looking at Nova Scotia, the deadliest U-boat attack off South Africa's coast. Now let's start with Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia was a British troops transport ship and was sunk on 28 November 1942 by U-157 off the coast of Richards Bay. Out of the 1,052 people on board, only 194 survived. That means 858 people lost their lives the day this ship sank. At 7:15 in the morning on 28 November 1942, the unescorted Nova Scotia, captained by Master Alfred Hender, was hit by 3 torpedoes from U-177 and sunk about 10 minutes later. When the Germans tried to identify the ship, they questioned 2 survivors who they took aboard, and after hearing Italian voices, they were a bit scared. And after the 2 Italian merchant sailors explained the situation to them, they decided to leave the area and radioed the BDU for orders. Due to the events of the sinking of the Laconia, the U-boat was ordered to continue its patrol, and the BDU notified the Portuguese, who sent the frigate Alfonso de Albuquerque from Lourenço Marques. The ship rescued 17 crew members. I apologize for the dog in the background. So the ship rescued 17 crew members, 1 gunner, and 3 military and naval personnel, 1 passenger, 42 guards, and 130 internees. The master, 96 crew members, 10 gunners, 8 military and naval personnel, 5 passengers, and 88 South African guards, and 650 Italian internees lost their lives that day. I'll just quickly close my door. So because of the Laconia incident, though that U-boat was forced to leave 858 people to die that day. The first of the ships sunk by the U-boats mentioned in the first presentation, the Belgian fighter, was a Belgian steam merchant sunk by U-68 on 9 October 1942. Out of the 54 people on board, 5 lost their lives. At about just before 5 in the morning on 9 October 1942, the unescorted Belgian fighter, captained by Master Achilles Costemans, was hit on the starboard side in the engine room by 1 torpedo from U-68 while steaming at about 10 knots, 80 miles southeast of Cape Town. A lookout had seen the phosphorescent track of the torpedo, but it was too late to take evasive action. The explosion killed 5 crew members and wounded 2 others. When the vessel settled by the stern, the remaining crew members and 6 gunners, the ship was unarmed with 4 and 5 machine guns, began to abandon ship in both port lifeboats, as the starboard aft boat had been destroyed and the other starboard boats swamped during launch. No distress signals were sent as the aerials were brought down, and the emergency set became useless when water entered it. At about 17 minutes past 5 in the morning, the U-boat fired a coup de grace that hit on the port side and caused the Belgian fighter to sink quickly by stern. The last boat was only about 50 yards away when the second torpedo hit. It was not damaged. It then picked up 6 men from rafts, waited for daylight to search the wide debris field for other survivors, and afterwards set sail towards the coast with the other boat in tow because its rudders was out of action. After about 10 hours, the survivors sighted the American steam merchant John Leeds at the horizon, picking up the survivors of Examalia, which had been sunk by the same U-boat earlier that night. They attracted the attention with smoke floats and parachute flares. They were picked up at about 3:30 that afternoon and landed at PE. On 14 October, 2 further crewmen on a raft were picked up by Ocean Justice, and they again survived the sinking when the Ocean Justice was hit and sunk by U-505 east of Trinidad on 7 November. Now, the Examelia was an American sea merchant sunk by U-68 on 9 October 1942. Of the 51 people on board, 11 lost their lives, one of which is seen in this slide. Torsten Carlson, born 18 April 1895, died 9 October 1942. At quarter to 4 a.m. on 9 October 1942, the unescorted Examelia, captained by Master Andrew Tolenko, was hit by one torpedo from U-68 about 20 miles south of the Cape of Good Hope, while proceeding to a non-evasive course at 10 knots in complete darkness. The torpedo struck at the bulkhead between the fire room and engine room. The explosion stopped the engines immediately, and the engines caused the ship to sink within 7 minutes. 53 of the 8 officers, 30 men, and 13 armed guards. The ship was armed with one 20 millimeters 2.30 cal guns. They abandoned the ship in 2 lifeboats, 4 rafts, and 2 floats. The first boat could not be successfully launched and went down with the ship, taking 2 men along. The other boat capsized because of the rapid sinking, drowning 1 man. The master, 1 officer, 6 men, and 3 armed guards died. Another lifeboat floated free, and the survivors righted the capsized boat and distributed the men between the 2 boats. U-68 surfaced and questioned the survivors before leaving. The same day, the survivors were picked up by the American steam merchant John Leeds and taken to Port Elizabeth, from which they traveled to Cape Town by train. On 21 October, all 40 survivors left Cape Town on the Zaanda, which was sunk by U-174 on 2 November. 21 of the original survivors died in the sinking. 11 crew members and 3 armed guards spent 5 days in a lifeboat before they were picked up by the Gulf State, which took them to Trinidad, arriving on 13 November. 5 others in a lifeboat reached the coast of Brazil 9 days after the sinking. We'll look at the Zaandam a bit later on. The Aldington Court was a British motor merchant that was sunk by U-172 on 31 October 1942. Of the 44 people on board, 34 lost their lives. At about 20 past 10 that night, on 31 October 1942, the unescorted Aldington Court, captained by Master Alfred Stewart, was hit by 2 G7As torpedoes from U-172 while steaming on a non-evasive course at 10 knots in fine weather about 1,000 miles west of Port Northern, Southwest Africa. The ship had left Trinidad in convoy Trin 16, which was dispersed during the night of about 11 or 12 October. The torpedo tracks were seen to approach from the starboard beam, but it was too late to take avoiding action, and they struck below the bridge and just forward of the engine room. The explosions threw up a considerable amount of debris, destroyed both starboard lifeboats, reached the gun nest on the starboard side of the bridge, and collapsed the bridge ladders. The crew of 32 men and 12 gunners began to abandon the ship in the lifeboats on the port side with great difficulties, as it was very dark night with no moon, and the ship soon listed 35 degrees to starboard. The jolly boat in charge of the third officer was launched with 13 men on it, and the only intact lifeboat was in charge of the chief officer and left within 5 minutes, with 15 occupants. Others jumped overboard and swam to rafts which were released. The master, second officer, second radio officer, and the gunner were still aboard when the ship rolled over and sank about 10 minutes after being hit. They clung to the wreckage until 2 men were picked up by each boat. The U-boat approached the survivors about 15 minutes later, and the Germans asked for the master, but on being told that he had not been saved, they ordered the chief officer to come aboard. He was taken below for questioning after being blindfolded, asked about the name of the ship, the cargo, and port of destination, and handed a pack of 20 cigarettes before he was sent back to his lifeboat. At daylight, the lifeboat took aboard 6 men from a nearby raft, and the area was searched for 4 missing men, 3 gunners who had been on duty at the stern gun, and the first radio officer who was still sending out distress signals. The jolly boat only had capacity for 7 men, so the number of survivors was reduced from 15 to 10 by transferring 5 men to the lifeboat. The master took charge of the bigger boat and set sail towards South Africa, ordering the jolly boat to keep as close as possible, but the lifeboats eventually drew ahead as it had more sails and was last seen about 40 miles east-southeast of the sinking position during the morning of the 3rd of November. It was never found. The master, 21 crew members, and 6 gunners were lost. The jolly boat made about 4 knots over the next days until the wind dropped and continued by pulling at intervals for a week, making very little progress. Thirst became a problem as they were unable to collect rainwater despite seeing heavy squalls passing ahead and behind the boat. Once a large whale passed the boat several times and almost capsized it. In the afternoon on 13 November, a ship was sighted and the survivors attempted to attract its attention by igniting all 3 available smoke floats. These either malfunctioned or had no effect. They were eventually spotted after the 3rd officer climbed the mast and waved with the ship. The city of Christiania picked up the 7 crew members and 3 gunners, hoisted their boats on board, and unsuccessfully searched for the other lifeboat. The overcrowded jolly boat had sailed 260 miles in 13 days, and everyone in it complained about swollen feet as they could barely move. The survivors were landed in Montevideo on 26 November, where the boatswain was taken to a hospital. During the rescue, he had to be lifted aboard with a rope as he could no longer move his legs, and one of them had to be amputated at the hospital. The remaining survivors were repatriated on the ship which had rescued them, arriving in the UK on 2 February 1943. Now, the city of Johannesburg is a very interesting ship, and she was a British steam merchant sunk by U-504 on 23 October 1942, and of the 90 people aboard, 4 lost their lives. About 12 minutes past 11 at night on 23 October 1942, the unescorted city of Johannesburg, captained by Master Walter Armour Owen, was hit by one of 2 torpedoes from U-504 while steaming on a zigzag course at 10.75 knots about 80 miles east-southeast of East London. The torpedo struck between the port side, blowing the hatches off the deep tanks and opening a hole that flooded these compartments immediately. All electricity failed and the engines had to be stopped when the engine room was flooded a few minutes later, causing the ship to be settled by the stern with a slight list to port. No distress signals could be sent as the main aerial was brought down and fouled the emergency aerial, and it was later discovered that the portable wireless set had been damaged while lowering into a lifeboat and was useless. 2 lifeboats had been destroyed and the rafts were jammed in the rigging, so the 21 crew members, 60 lascars, and 9 gunners abandoned the ship in the 4 remaining lifeboats, which were launched safely within 5 minutes, despite rough sea and high swell. Before leaving, the gunners tried to train the 4-inch gun, but it was damaged and could no longer be turned. The master was last to leave the ship after making sure that no one was left on board. At 22:11 on that night, the U-boat surfaced after firing a coup de grace at the ship, which was hit at the hatch on the port side, but only settled further on an even keel. The Germans then questioned the survivors in one of the lifeboats and left the area after the city of Johannesburg suddenly broke in two amidship and sank at midnight. 4 lascars were lost. The boat in charge of the master had 11 persons on board and rescued 2 swimming in the waters. Quartermaster H. Burney was picked up by a lifeboat with 28 people and later stated that he was alongside the U-boat after he had surfaced and even touched the plate when he was told to swim ashore to the lifeboat. He was asked no questions and the engines of the U-boat remained stopped until the man was clear. The other 2 boats held 19 respectively 25 people, but owing to the rough sea, the lifeboats could not approach each other to even up the survivors. The master told the other boats to remain in the vicinity while his boat set sail in order to get help and made 114 miles in 24 hours before he and 12 survivors were picked up by the Dutch steam merchant Zapen, about 8 miles from the coast. And on 25 October, they landed on Durban. However, the boat with 19 occupants also set sail and only made half the distance before they were rescued by the British motor merchant King Edwin on 26 October and landed at Cape Town 3 days later. The 54 survivors in the 2 boats that waited near the sink position were picked up by the British steam merchant Fort George after 12 hours and landed in Port Elizabeth on 25 October. The Firethorn, which is the last ship, was a Panamanian motor merchant that was sunk by U-172 on 7 October 1942. Of the 61 on board, 12 lost their lives. At about 9:30 on 7 October 1942, the unescorted Firethorn, captained by Master Paul F. Schultz, was hit by 2 torpedoes from U-172 while steaming on a non-evasive course of 30 knots, about 60 miles northwest of Cape Town. The first torpedo struck on the port side just below the bridge, tearing open the hull. The second struck in the engine room a few seconds later, causing the ship to sink within 2 minutes with a heavy list to port. No lifeboat could be launched and 40 crew members and 21 armed guards abandoned ship in 4 rafts and a U-boat which floated free. The master, 9 crew members, and 2 armed guards died. The U-boat surfaced after the ship sank and questioned the survivors before leaving the area. The U-boat was found bottom was rightened and used to pick up the men swimming in the water and place them on the rafts, which were eventually lashed together. 6 men in the U-boat set forth for the coast. They were spotted by an aircraft the next day and picked up 4 hours later by HMS Rock Rose. On 9 October, the remaining survivors were picked up by the same corvette and 21 survivors by the South African MS whaler HMS AS Springs and taken to Cape Town, arriving later that day. 6 armed guards and 2 crewmen from Firethorn were lost during repatriation on Zaanda, which was sunk by U-174 on 2 November. 1 crew member from the Firethorn survived 82 days on a raft together with 2 survivors from the Dutch ship. And here we have them. Before I end this presentation, I want to show the next few images from this raft mentioned in the previous slide. So, in the images, we have Nick Hugendaum, Cornelius van der Slot, and Basil Dominique Izzy. Basil Dominique Izzy was 19 years old with Italian heritage from South Bar, Massachusetts. Cornelius van der Slot was Dutch and a Zaandam crew member, and Nick Hoogendaam was a 17-year-old Dutch merchant mariner who had been a seaman since he was 12 years old. Now, this is the raft as seen from USS PC 576, and that looks extremely small for those three men. And the next image is survivors being helped to board the patrol craft after being rescued. And I can guarantee they were very relieved when they boarded that boat. And from left to right, we have Cornelius van der Slot, Nicolaas Hoogendaam, and Basil Dominique Izzy after being rescued. And the final image I have is of Izzy when the thing he missed the most on the raft was his mother's spaghetti, like most Italian people. And when he got home, she made it for him the very first night after he arrived home. Thank you very much.